Men, we live in a day where only 4 out of 10 Americans understand the basics of American history. And you have heard the saying, those who cannot remember the past are destined to repeat it. But why do we need to learn history and understand the basics? How does it help us men live better? My guest for this show is going to answer all of these questions. So today, we are diving into some incredible men of history, pre-Christian men of Rome, actually, to learn some fascinating stories and understand how they displayed virtue against incredible odds. So stay with us as we give you some lessons to better your lives through history. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us in another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. I am grateful that you are here. I'm your host, John Heinen, and I am blessed to be joined by a good friend and great man, Ryan Scheel, where we are going to talk about 5 ancient Romans that every man should know. But before we get there, if this is your first time joining us, please hit that subscribe button. If you're on YouTube, hit that bell button so you get any of those notifications. In addition, I am so excited to let you know that we have launched the Catholic Gentleman Plus, which is a live program. It's going on ongoing, week by week, month by month. We're helping refine men in holiness, help them understand what it means to be a man and to grow in holiness. We've broken it down into 3 categories, which is the spiritual life, your prayer, your relationship with God, and all those things, your self-mastery, which we're going to talk a lot about today, and your relationships with others, right? So these 3 categories, which were things that were broken at the fall, we've got live guest experts that are coming on. We've got mini-series coming out. We've got a ton of stuff going over there. So I encourage you to head over to CatholicGentlemanPlus.com or look in the show notes and click that button. If you want to support us, that's where you can go. Sign up for a subscription to Catholic Gentleman Plus. For all the moms and women and wives that are out there that like to support us, we have a handful, and I'm so grateful for you. If you head over to CatholicGentleman.com/support, obviously, if you don't want Catholic Gentleman Plus subscription, head over to support, and you can donate there and continue to help us expand the cause, reach more men, help men understand what it means to be a man and grow in holiness. So, moving on, we've got something that both Ryan Scheel and I think is incredibly important for men to understand, and that is history. And so I kind of want to start, Ryan, and talk to you about why should men understand history? We live here in America where 9 out of 10 men know that Russell Crowe was the gladiator, but only 4 out of 10 Americans actually know that their own American history. And I would say 1 out of 10,000 actually know that anything about ancient Rome or a cursory glance. So I'd love to hear from you why the study of history is so important for men.
You know, well, John, number one, first, it's a great honor to be on. I love the Catholic Gentleman. I'm a member of Catholic Gentleman Plus. Like you said, we're great friends, but this is my first time on the Catholic Gentleman, and I feel so much more refined than I do over on the slums of my show, the Catholic Talk Show. So I'm really pleased to be able to be on here.
Yeah, thank you so very much. And honestly, just before we dive into that, if you haven't checked out the Catholic Talk Show, I'm going to leave that link in the show notes too, so you guys can head over there. For those of you who have watched the Catholic Talk Show, you're going to get a new side of Ryan here. One of his historical intelligence and metaphors and all these great things that he brings to really every conversation. So again, thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, sure. So I think that's a great segue because we're talking about the people that you hang around with, right? And you are the sum of the people that you hang around with the most. Now, you can watch TV, you can hang out at the bar, you can do things with people who maybe have low ambitions and low, ceilings in life. Or you can hang around people who are ambitious, who have drive, who have discipline, and, steel sharpens steel. I think it's the same thing with understanding history, is that you start to familiarize yourself with the greatest people who've accomplished the greatest things throughout history, and that sharpens you. It raises what your expectations of yourself should be. It also gives you the opportunity to look at what made these people successful, what virtues did these men and women throughout history have that made them somebody worth being mentioned as the greats of all throughout history. So I think it's, number one, it's kind of analogous to how we look at the saints. Now I know the saints have a more metaphysical reality of being in the great cloud of witnesses in heaven, but in many ways they're also the heroes of the faith. They're the examples of men and women who have lived the faith to the highest order. So when you're looking at history and historical figures of great magnitude, it's the same thing. They're the people who have lived the human experience to the highest magnitude. So that's why it's so important to understand history. And I think our world understood this deeply until the last maybe 50 years. You had your classical educations, John, which I know you're a huge proponent of, where every person who was educated would learn Greco-Roman history because it is the foundation of Western society. And when we find ourselves in a time and place in the 21st century in the United States of America where we see the Western world losing its identity, losing its roots, understanding the roots of our society and how they go back in their foundations to Greece and Rome, and especially here in America in a Republican system, if we're looking at the political nature of it, the Republican era of Rome, which is what we're going to cover today, you understand what the pitfalls and the potential things that can ruin our modern world, but then also what the remedies are. So that it's, again, there's so many reasons to understand history. Those are just a few of them.
I think that's really great. And I appreciate you saying that, because for those men listening, men and women that are listening, that you don't understand that our society here in America is based on the Greek and Roman culture. Now you know, and it's really important as part of our identity, as part of really, I would say, our civil and civic duty and our understanding as patriots here in America, to understand not only the founding fathers, but also the principles in which they based our society on, which are some incredible principles. And I had Edward von Habsburg, the Archduke, on not too long ago, where he said there in Europe, they're still looking to America with hope that these principles that defined our republic, that defined the creation here in America, will hold out, even though they see them being lost and we here see them being lost as well. So I couldn't agree more that to better understand the world in which we're living in today, you can look at the history that has brought us here and the history that was the foundational underpinning of here, in America. So I really think that's great. And I appreciate you sharing that. Before we jump into all five of these men, I think it's important to have a little conversation about virtue, because that's what this is the Catholic gentleman, right? We're talking about self-mastery. We're talking about growth and virtue. When we look to the men of history, we can see virtues that they displayed and that they had outward opportunities to either flee from or set their roots deep in. And these men that we chose today were the ones that chose to set their roots deep in these virtues. And so we're going to pick out a couple virtues. While there are many, we're going to pick out a couple as we go through it. But before we get on, I think it's important just to remind everybody that your character as a man is defined by your outward expression of virtues versus vices, right? If virtues are the good habits that we are working towards, working to obtain and understand, and the vices are the bad habits, the man that presents and displays and works on the good habits is going to live a happier life. He's going to be a man as God created him to be, and he's going to be able to bring Christ to others. And so there's a lot of virtues. We're not going to go into all of them, but I think it's really important just to kind of remind men of the importance of virtues.
That's right. And I think Roman society, and in particular, I mentioned this earlier, but we really are the ones that we've picked for this list today are all pre-imperial Romans. And if you know anything about the history of Rome, I'd say there's three great periods. There's the period of the kings of Rome. That's the founding, the seven, mythical or, semi-historical kings of Rome. Then the Republican era, then the imperial era after Caesar Augustus, right? I chose these ones when we talked about this, John, from the Republican era, because those are the ones when virtue was most prevalent in Roman society. And a lot of contemporary Romans at the time said the reason that they slipped away from a republic led by the people to an imperial system that lacked a lot of the morality of the Republican era is because they started to lose their virtues. And I think we find ourselves in a very similar place in the United States of America, that we were founded on a very Republican virtue, not, Republican Party, but in the classical sense. That's why we have a Senate. That's why our buildings that's why the Capitol building is named the Capitol, like the Capitoline Hill in Rome. It's why it looks like a Greco-Roman edifice. It's why the Supreme Court looks like it. I mean, most European powers have parliamentary systems. We're pretty unique in that we have a Republican system where, we have a Senate and we have the House of Representatives, which is pretty much, analogous to the tribune of the plebeians, right? So we are based on this. And looking at the Roman Republican system when they had those virtues and their society was driven forward by virtues and ultimately led them to conquer the world of the time was their virtuous nature. And those, I think, we'll be able to illustrate, in the lives of these 5 Roman men.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm just you can hear our listeners that Ryan knows this stuff in and out. He is the expert. I am not. While I understand these things, I expressed to him in prep that I really enjoyed getting a deeper dive into some of these men's lives, and actually found myself going down multiple rabbit trails to learn more. And so hopefully this will be the first of multiple episodes. So before we get going, I chose a quote from Cicero, a great Roman figure that we are going to talk about. And in that quote, he says, "Cling fast to virtus." And virtus, obviously the root or the Latin word from that we get virtue from. He continues, "I beg you, men of Rome, it is heritage that our ancestors bequeathed you. All else is false and doubtful, ephemeral and changeful. Only virtues stands firmly fixed. Its roots run deep. It can never be shaken by any violence, never moved from its place." And so with that, I'd like to turn to our first Roman man that we want to discuss in the virtue that he possessed, and that is Cincinnatus. And I want you, Ryan, to say his full name because
sure. Well, you're looking at the wrong guy, either for expertise in history. I'm an armchair historian, a Monday morning historian, and my Latin's terrible. So you're going to have everyone out there. I know anytime I try to speak Latin in the comments on my show, people say, dude, you're not good at Latin. And the people who are classically trained in it give me all kinds of business. And it's deserved, but hey, man, I'm doing my best, right?
That's right.
So this is Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus, right? And you'll notice that there's a kind of a Roman name system. You have your cognomens and all these things. Usually the way that a name would work is that you have the given name, which would be Lucius, the family name, Quintus, and then kind of the nickname, Cincinnatus. So whenever you hear a Roman name, you know that the third name is kind of like a nickname, and it usually will talk about maybe some characteristic of it. It's like, tall Jim or whatever. So it'd be Lucius Quintus Magnus, right? It means he's big.
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, Cincinnatus, we were talking about the United States being founded on Republican Greco-Roman virtues. And to the founding fathers of the United States, Cincinnatus was one of the great models of what a statesman, a politician, and a civilian citizen leader should be. If you look at, George Washington, the founder and father of our country, modeled his entire political, military, and public career on the model of Cincinnatus. So who was Cincinnatus? Cincinnatus was born at the very tail end of the king stage of Rome. So he was probably born during the reign of Superbus, right, the last king of Rome. And he was a farmer. Now, he was definitely a patrician, right? When a patrician in Rome meant you were one of the founding families of Rome. So when Rome was founded, you had 100 families who were chosen. They were the wealthiest, most educated, and they were chosen to be the bedrock of society. And that became the Senate, right? So he was definitely of the senatorial class, but he was not, one of the, mega rich or whatever. He had a 4-acre farm, but he had a historically elite family.
Yeah.
So he had went through, all the stages of service in Rome and basically had a political falling out and was relegated to the sidelines of politics in Rome and basically retreated back to his little farm, probably doing olives or cabbages, which was pretty common back then, and more or less withdrew from political life. Now, Rome in this period was not it It was not the empire. Again, remember, this is the Republican era. Rome was just a little city-state. I mean, Rome consisted of a couple, little outcrops on top of the 7 hills of Rome and a few farming villages around. Rome was not an empire. Rome was, again, just a little city-state. And one of their main enemies was the Aquii, who was essentially another city-state next to them. And they were constantly battling with the Aquii. So in 456 BC, the Aquii and the Romans start beefing, right? And they both raise armies. And in this period, armies, maybe 6,000, 7,000 men, right? So what happened is the Aquii tricked the Romans under the leadership of the council for the year. And they started retreating. In the ancient world, in battles, retreat was one of your best strategies because battles were won during the rout. When somebody was retreating, then the order broke down, everyone chased them, took out the other army. So a lot of times what would happen as a strategy is people would fake a retreat that they could then get their enemy off guard. So the Aquii faked a retreat through a valley, right? And then the Romans followed after them because they sensed blood in the water. They're going after them without care or caution. But what had happened is the Aquii had another contingency of troops go around to the other side of the valley and blocked the Romans in. So the Romans were trapped with no escape. And essentially, this could have been the death knell for Rome. It could have been the death in the crib of Rome. It could have died before it ever got a chance to be an empire, right? So the Senate hears about this, and just a few of the horsemen were able to get back to Rome and say, look, we are in a bad place. We are in our own little Dunkirk. We are stuck here, right? Yeah. So the Senate's freaking out. Everyone's like, oh, well, what are we going to do? We're in big trouble. This could be, the end, right? Rome wasn't built in a day, but it could be destroyed in a day. And this could be that day. So what they did is, Rome's political system, they always had the Senate, and then every year they elected 2 consuls, basically co-presidents, I think is an easy way to think of it, who ruled for 1 year. You can never rule consecutively. And you had 2 of them as a counterbalance, right? So that no one man could ever, become king again, because Romans had a major aversion to kings after the last queen, Tarquinius Superbus. So the Senate was like, well, we need to do something. So what they did is they basically declared martial law. And this is something you'll see that happens throughout the Republican period in Rome, is that they declared a dictator. Now, we hear the term dictator and we think of, Fidel Castro or one of these absolute rulers. But in Rome, it was kind of emergency political powers, right? Saying we are in a crisis and we need to be able to cut through the red tape or the loggerheads that might happen in a dual conciliar system. So they're like, who could we possibly get who can solve this for us? And they said, well, Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus is the only man who's got the chops and the character to do this. So they sent a messenger out to Cincinnatus's farm outside, past on the other side of the Tiber, and Cincinnatus was out in his field working. He's wearing nothing but a loincloth, right? Out in his field, plowing the field like a citizen farmer should, right? Because, that's what you do. So Rome, the messengers from the Senate says, we have important news. And he's like, is everything okay? I mean, this is kind of exactly how it went. He's like, you better go and put your toga on, because you couldn't hear official senatorial communiques without wearing the traditional toga. So he yells to his wife, can you go grab me my toga? So he's like, all right, just wiping himself off, puts his toga on. They're like, you've been elected dictator, which means you have supreme power over all of Rome.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So what's the situation? So the situation is this: we've got the people trapped in this valley. We got our soldiers there, and we're in a bad place. So, okay, he accepts the power, full, unconditional power over everyone. More power than a king, right? Because this is an emergency. So he says, he gets to work and he says, I want every fighting age man to bring 12 wooden spears, and 5 days worth of food. 5 days worth of provisions. And everyone's like, that's oddly specific. So what he does is he musters all of these fighting age men between 16 and 30. All of them have to bring 5 days provisions and 12 long lances, wooden lances. He marches them out to this valley, and he builds another concentric ring around the Aquii. So now you've got like a bullseye. You have Romans under Cincinnatus, you have the Aquii, and then you have the original soldiers. So now you got 3 concentric rings. He takes all those stakes, those spears, sets them up so they can't get out. And he goes in and absolutely wins the battle, takes out the Aquii, saves the soldiers, even grants pardon to the Aquii, but makes them pass through under the yoke, right? Which was a Roman tradition of basically you take the yoke you would put on an ox, and by passing underneath it, you have to bow, you're humiliated, and you're basically saying you're subjugated to Rome. The whole process, the whole military operation where he was granted all the power by the Senate of Rome took 14 days, 2 weeks. He comes back victorious, and they're like, wow, we'll give you anything you want. We'll give you all the land you want. We'll give you all the, we'll give you the seaside villa. We'll give you, you want to stay in power? And he said, no, I got to go finish my harvest. Returned all the power that he had granted. So, and this is a man with all the power over life and death, over every person who is his peer and fellow citizen, and he returned it back to the Senate and went back to be a citizen farmer because his crops are ready. And this same exact situation happened again in 439 BC, where there was a potential uprising of someone trying to establish themselves as a king, and the exact same thing happened. He took the power, solved the problem, and gave it back. Now, this is the model of humility. Like, you can have all the power in the world over other men's lives, over your own life, over life and death, politics and money. But to be able to say it is a tool to be used for for our society, for the benefit of our society, not be something to be wielded as a personal power, that takes a lot of discipline and humility. And George Washington modeled himself after this. That's why after the Revolutionary War, he returned command of the Continental Army to the statesman. That's why after 2 terms, he retired. He set these precedents specifically in mind after Cincinnatus. And you would even go on to see that there was something called the Society of Cincinnati. After the Civil War, anybody who was after the Revolutionary War, anybody who was an officer in the Revolutionary War was able to be a member of the Society of Cincinnati because there was such a hero to them. So you had people like Hamilton, who's, on the 20. You have Knox, who Fort Knox is named after. Yeah. You have Steuben, who, Steubenville is named after. You even had the society go over because the French helped us so much that King Louis over in France allowed people to have a French branch of the Order of Cincinnati. So, obviously, the city of Cincinnati is named after him. So he was such an important figure for his humility and for the concept of that one man should not have too much power. And if he does, he should wield it responsibly and return it to the state, because the state and God are who grant power, not individuals. So that's that's kind of the story of Cincinnatus, and that's why he's such a good example of the virtue of humility and Republican patriotism, societal virtue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's phenomenal. You did an excellent job, and it really is incredible learning about him. And then Americans here, we have to think about it. What if George Washington wasn't steeped in the understanding of the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic? What would he have done after his second term? Now, I'm not taking anything away from George Washington, a very virtuous man himself. But the point is that these were all the reasons. Like, he loved Cincinnatus. He was following him. He read it, and he was like, yeah, this guy understood that the society, the republic, is above me, a God. In our case here, as now Christians, Catholics, thanks be to God, we understand that as well. And that's exactly what Cincinnatus did. Now, Cincinnatus, he did it twice. He was declared dictator twice, and then both times within a short period of time, he did, like you said, he did his business, and it was phenomenal. He was the right man for the job because he had military history, but he also had character and integrity. And while we know here that our growth in virtue as men is something much higher than ourselves because it is from God. Back then, they just understood that it was the right, whether they understood God or they were pagan or anything like that, they understood. And there's a divide back then, too, where pursuing virtues were for what they could do for ourselves versus pursuing virtues because in and of themselves, they are the right way to live. And Cincinnatus chose the latter, right? That he pursued virtues because it was the right way to live, because virtues in and of themselves was worthy of pursuit, not because of the lavish lifestyle or betterment of your societal figure or your relationships that would ultimately grant you if you did this. It was less selfish, I would say, and more outward and more wise in that. And so, yes, next time, men, you are put in a position of authority or position of power, remind yourself that all power comes from God, and be humble within that. And the problem with pride, sorry, I just now thinking about this, the problem with pride that we all know is when we allow it to just dig within us, it becomes coercive. It just eats itself. We become blind to other people. We become blind to our role as a neighbor. The second commandment, as Christ stated, to love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. We become blinded to that as men when we allow pride to overtake us. And so we know that humility is such an important virtue, and we have such a great example in a man that, not like us. I'll be put in a position within work where I will, have a degree of authority over a handful of employees, but not over an entire nation. and then a kind of absolute power over the Senate and the council and all that. And so really a phenomenal figure, somebody I encourage you guys to learn more about. And so segueing to our second incredible man of Rome and history. You got something you want to say?
No. I thought we were going to get into.
Yeah, good. We are. We're going to move on.
You mentioned kind of the societal value put on virtue, right? So where did that Roman inclination towards virtue come from, right? Because if you know anything about the founding of Rome, Rome was founded by a bunch of, it's kind of analogous to the founding of Australia, right? It was cast-off society, people who had went bankrupt in neighboring cities, people who were, misfits, criminals, etc. Like, they didn't have a glorious founding. Now, they would try to say, it went back to Aeneas fleeing from the Trojan War or whatever to try to mythologize it. But really, they were a society of misfits and outcasts. And that's the founding of Rome. And that was the founder of Rome was Romulus, right? That's where the name comes from.
Yeah.
Now, I'm always fascinated, though, in history. There's a lot of very powerful and influential men who set up a kingdom, and then as soon as they die, their kingdom is gone, right? Look at it's gone because it was based on the power and the virtue of their charisma and the force of their nature.
Yeah.
But the ones that last, you always have to look at that second, right? Whether we're looking at in the church, we're looking at Pope St. Linus. The concept that the power passes from Peter to Linus, that right there, Christ gave Peter the authority and the primacy among the apostles, but that it passes to Peter, not maybe Paul or St. John or whomever, that right there shows the chair of St. Peter being established. Or if you look at, like we just talked about, Washington, declining to run for a fourth term, and then you see that, our second president, John Adams, right? That power passes and that the system continues. That's the test of a good system. You could have Napoleon Bonaparte's all day long, but when they die, it breaks apart, right? Mm-hmm. The second king of Rome after Romulus was a soldier. He was, the son of Mars, right? Who was born, suckled on a wolf. He was a bad dude, right? And that could have cast Rome as a society of warriors, very much like the Trojans, where it's just, or the Lacedaemonians, who are just, it's all about fighting. That's all their society. But Rome, and the reason that we're talking about Rome as far as virtue, and the reason I think that, Christianity was able to flourish so well is that Rome was a very fertile seedbed of religiosity. Right?
Yeah.
Rome had deep religious inclinations, even if they did not worship the true God. Even if they were pagan, their religiosity by nature and their natural inclination, if you look at C.S. Lewis's argument for the desire of God, because we desire God, therefore God must exist. I think the Romans sensed that.
Yeah,
and they
if
were
I
incredibly...
could.
Yeah, please.
If I could, I completely agree with you. And I think that this is important, right? Because we as men, and you hear it on our show all the time, we talk about how we are created in the imago Dei. So are the Romans, right? Now, they didn't have the fullness of the truth through Christ. They didn't have the fullness of the truth even through Israel and Moses and Noah and all the different fathers, Abraham, obviously, to really understand that. They didn't have that, but they were still created in the imago Dei. They were still created as men, created by God, held into existence by God. And you're exactly right, that religiosity is a part of it. And then before we dive even further, I think it's important to point out that religion or religiosity is a virtue. It's actually a moral virtue, right? So it's something that you might not have thought about, but Aquinas even found it as a distinct virtue that falls under the cardinal virtue of justice. And Aquinas talked about that obviously religion is, to render to God that which is of him. And in our next figure that we're going to talk about, he clearly understood that in one way, shape, or form, and was able to bring it to the front. And it's pretty phenomenal as well how he was able to live that out and how he was able to execute that within Rome.
Yeah, and that's the second king of Rome, the one who succeeded Romulus, and his name was Numa Pompilius, right? Numa, is commonly how he's referred to. So, like I was saying, Rome was founded as a bunch of brigands, right? And a bunch of men, rugged, tough men, right?
That's right.
Went and found the city. Now, they found themselves in a problem, right? They had no women, right? Okay, so we want to perpetuate this. We got this great place, 7 hills, all kinds of good fertile ground, good hunting, good fishing. But if there's no women, it kind of dies out after one generation. That's natural biology for people who might be confused about that in these days and ages. But so they needed women, but there was none around. So there was a neighboring tribe called the Sabines, right? Mm-hmm. But at first they were trying to marry themselves. Everyone's like, I don't want my daughter to marry a Roman. These guys are, backwoods, militia type dudes. No, thank you. So what they did is they invited the Sabines, the entire city-state, to Rome for a festival. And when they got everyone drunk, they basically kidnapped all the women. Kidnapped all of them and said, you're our wives now, and expelled all the Sabine men. And now Romans got wives who are kind of ill-gotten. It's one of the most famous themes and motifs in medieval art. It's called the rape of the Sabine women. Yeah. So then, all the Sabine men are like, well, this is a problem. We are going to absolutely have to go and reclaim our women. But at this point, the year has passed, and these are our husbands. They're the father of our children. So the Sabine women actually got in between the Roman men and the Sabine men and negotiated a peace treaty. So Rome, you think of Rome, their paternal lineage is Roman, but their maternal lineage is Sabine, right? That's their mother's name, right? So you can't understand Rome without understanding that it's a co-op between Rome and the Sabines. So now, once the first king of Rome dies, the Sabines are like, okay, we had a Roman king, we want a Sabine king. And the Romans are like, no way, dude, we are the ones in charge here, we're the men here. And they're like, well, then we're not going along. So once again, this is one of those things where Rome might not have existed because the very fabric of their society could have been torn apart in that first succession. Yeah. So finally, they come to a compromise saying, the Sabine said, Rome, you can pick, your Senate can pick whoever you want, but it has to be a Sabine. Cool. So the Romans picked a very kind of peculiar and very odd bird in Numa Pompilius. He was known for walking by himself quietly in meditation. He was known as being very austere, very religious, very ritualistic, making sure that he was always fulfilling his obligations. And this is a pretty big departure from Romulus, who would kill his own brother and, drink wolf milk and, climbed fences and killed people, right? This is a very big departure. But this is the second half of understanding the Roman mystique. You have the absolute military order, but you have the absolute desire for religiosity, which is why you see in Roman society all the way through the 700s, you see them, adopting every religion. You see the soldiers like, oh, well, wow, we saw this thing called Zoroastrian. It's super cool. All right. Or Mazda Thora or Judaism or Christianity. Cool. Let's learn about this religion, right? so their natural inclination towards religion goes back to Numa Pompilius.
Yeah.
So as king, he established that the Romans were not just going to be brutes and soldiers. They were also going to be religious farmers. You know, when you're not fighting, you're going to be a pastoral, religious man who does their duty to the gods, takes care of their civic pride. So Numa Pompilius set up at things like all the order of the sacrifices, built the temples. He set, we still think of holy days, right? Because we are the Roman Catholic Church. He was the one who set apart standard days and holy days in Roman society in the 6th century BC.
Yeah.
He also, and this is a really interesting thing, Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, established a religious office for who would be the high priest of Roman society. Now, John, you on Twitter?
I am, yeah.
Do you follow the Pope on Twitter?
I do.
Do you know the Pope's handle on Twitter?
Yeah, Pontifex.
Pontifex. Pontifex, or Pontifex, the great pontiff, that title and that office was founded by Numa Pompilius as the head priest of Rome. So when we hear the word Pontifex, it goes all the way back to the second king of Rome as the chief. Pontifex Maximus means the chief bridge builder, which basically meant this is the person in Roman society charged with building the bridge between the citizens and the gods. And that's why it's still, as a Roman bishop, that is still a title of the Pope. And you see all kinds of people like Julius Caesar was actually the Pontifex Maximus. Yeah. Julius Caesar was the Pope, of the Roman religion before Christianity. And you'll even, so I think it's really important to understand the religiosity of Rome. You can't understand why Christianity was able to succeed in Rome without understanding that Rome, from its very inception, was built on a desire for religious truth. Even though it took them 500 years to find it, in the due time of the course of the unfolding of Revelation. But why did God choose this time and place to become incarnate? Why then? Why, in his wisdom, would he have found this time to be the time where his faith would have spread throughout the world? It's because the Roman society and Roman culture was set up to accept it. It was the fertile ground. So if you look at the parable of the sower, it was the fertile ground that it would take root in. It had the vast empire of interconnectivity in the roads so that it could be spread around. In his divine wisdom, that is the perfect time for the faith to spread. And it goes back to, again, Numa Pompilius.
Yeah, I think that's phenomenal. And there's so many great stories. We could actually probably spend the full episode talking about him. I was incredibly fascinated. While I had heard him, I had never really dove into him, but I think it's like some really great points to just add to what you've already brought up. And we know this because of Plutarch, right? Plutarch wrote a lot about Pompilius and wrote a lot about the founding of Rome. And so we know a lot of this stuff, but yeah, he lived a very severe, disciplined lifestyle, right? One filled and breathed in of self-mastery, if I could, where he didn't allow himself to entertain a lot of luxuries. He didn't allow himself to entertain a lot of great things. When he was to be elected, he paused the election. He paused the Senate, and he said, I don't just need approval of men and of the Senate. I need approval of the gods. And so he started to look for signs and omens and things like that to make sure that this was the right move for him before he just dove into it. And again, understanding the pre-Christian era where he would have lacked, the prophetic abilities and illuminations and stuff that we have today, it shows a real deep sign of understanding of something higher than yourself. And he moved in that. And there are a couple other things that I like is that right when he became the ruler of Rome, he decided to immediately disband the Solaris, which was Romulus's 300 guards, right? They were the fighters, they were the blood, they were the grit of the organization. But he did that intentionally to show that he looked for a time of harmony and peace among men, not one of battle and war, not one that would continue this sort of strife and difficulties. And he wanted to send a sign too to all the men that had lived like that we don't want this. And so the final thing that I'm going to state regarding Pompilius is the fact that if you know anything about Rome, you know that the door or the gates of Rome were closed during times of peace and open during times of war. And during his 43-year reign, the doors remained closed the entire time. But just to give you in perspective, after he died, the doors remained open for the next 400 years. So there was, again, a real great founding, like you were saying, on this. And I think it's so good. And everything from you mentioning him, institution of the feast days, if you will, the priest and the temples of Janus and all of these different things were done intentionally. I know that he would go out to the farmers, right? So he would give all the poor and the plebeians this land, right? Because he really wanted the agricultural lifestyle to build up, because then that would benefit society. And he would spend time going out among them to make sure that they knew that he was on their side, and to send a political message or a public message to everybody else that this was important and that this is as important to the foundation of Rome and the building of Rome. And so again, that idea of religiosity, or that idea of the moral virtue of religion, really was built within him, and like you said, God saw all, knew all, and brought this about during this time. I think it's pretty phenomenal.
Looking at also, there's the personal virtue of religiosity, but we've also been touching on societal needs here, and kind of the parallel between Rome and the United States in the 21st century. It also shows the need for society to be religious to properly function, right? Not just individuals. It's not just a private matter that you keep in your closed house and you never talk about it because it's, impolite. Religion is the primary thing that holds a society together. And as society kind of gets into a more post-Christian phase, you see society collapse more and more. So if you look at what Machiavelli said in his section on the religiosity of Rome, he was talking about Numa, and he says, and I'll quote him here, "As the observances of the ordinances of religion is the cause of the greatness of state, so their neglect is the occasion of its decline. Since a kingdom without the fear of God must either fall to pieces or must be maintained by fear of some prince who supplies that influence not supplied by religion." So basically, if you want a free society, it needs to be religious. Otherwise, you will have either dictatorship, you will be held together by commerce, you'll be held together by some of the crazy theories that we have out there now with social engineering, but you need that common thing. And the only benefice, the only good-oriented one is through religion. And that's another thing that we see in our society is the need for religious adherence. I'd like to say religious coherence. I'm kind of a papist, but I don't think that's, in the American system, we're not going to reinstitute the Inquisition to, have a homogenous religion. But I think as a society, we need to refine our religion. We need to refine that we are a country founded on God and under God, right? And without that, again, just like Machiavelli says when talking about Numa, you will invariably see the society collapse.
Yeah. Wow. Well stated. That's really great. So moving forward, we are going to talk about the virtue of prudence, and we got another great story that we're going to share with you, and we're going to talk about Fabius. And so Ryan, if you want to take it away and share with us a little bit about this military dictator himself, Fabius, who had quite a lot to offer and definitely brought, kept Rome together, honestly, with his strategies.
So I think, number one, these stories are so much fun. So, I mean, if you're still with us, I know a lot of people like to put on podcasts and, fall asleep and take a nap to them. So I hope I'm not putting you to sleep, but if I am, pick it back up when you wake up.
When you wake up.
This third one, and I think you're going to see this as a recurring theme throughout all of history, but in particular the men that we're covering here today, is that they have virtue, but the opportunity to display that virtue comes in a time of crisis. Virtues untested are kind of concepts. virtues are only virtuous when they are applied, in a time of distress, or when the virtue has to counter some sort of lack of virtue or some sort of challenge. So you'll see that all of these men are rising to the occasion during a great crisis. So this third one is Quintus Fabius Maximus Varicosus. Again, like varicosus, that means it means warty, which means, he had a wart, right? That was his nickname. He had a wart on his lip, or a mole, or whatever. So Quintus Fabius Maximus Varicosus, but we'll just kind of call him Fabius. He, again, was a member of the senatorial class who found himself in times of great distress. And this is during the Second Punic War. Now, if we look at the analogy of the United States and Rome as kind of following similar paths, Rome had always been just, a collection of city-states, or maybe had hegemony over the Italian peninsula, but they were kind of a regional power, just like the United States was in the 1800s. Hey, let's keep an eye on them, but they're not a world power yet. They're kind of over there across the sea, across the Adriatic for the Romans, or across the Atlantic for the Americans. But the thing that propelled Rome into worldwide greatness and made them the masters of the Mediterranean was the Punic Wars. And the Punic Wars are very analogous, in Roman history to World War I and World War II, which found America elevate into a place as a global superpower. So Phoenicia was really the great power in the Western Mediterranean, along with Rome. And, when you have two growing potential superpowers, they're going to rub up against each other.
Yeah.
And you had, the first Punic War, Rome conquered, right? And it was kind of a stalemate, just kind of like an uneasy tension, just very much like World War I, where, hey, we're going to just put a pause on this for 30, 40 years and fight it out again later because everyone's kind of sick of the attrition. So during the Second Punic War really is, I would say, when Rome was most at peril of being destroyed forever. One of the greatest generals of all time is Hannibal. Hannibal is right up there with Alexander the Great, or Napoleon Bonaparte, or Belisarius, or Genghis Khan, right? One of the great generals of all time. People still study his military tactics today, marching elephants over the Alps is just an absolute madman move, but he pulled it off. So you're in this war with Phoenicia. The greatest general in the world has marched freaking elephants, and they're about into the Italian peninsula, and you're in some serious trouble, right?
Yeah.
Well, one of the first, in this story, there was a battle called the Battle of Lake Trasimene. And this is the first big encounter between the Roman legions and Hannibal. And Hannibal wiped the floor at the Romans. Absolutely. It was the worst defeat in Roman history up until that point. Just an absolute nightmare. Well, again, like we talked about in the story of Cincinnatus, the Senate freaked out. Oh, goodness. We are in some serious trouble. We need to get one of those dictator things again, right? We need to get one of those people who can see us out of this. So they had elected Fabius as dictator. And dictator lasted for 1 year. On the 365th day, it went away, right? Yeah. So he was elected dictator to deal with and create a strategy to counter the invasion of Hannibal into the Italian peninsula. So Fabian had this, and this is why we're talking with him in the virtue of prudence. His strategy was like, look, and his humility is like, I can't beat Hannibal one-on-one. I can't line my troops up with the greatest general ever and win. He's going to beat us. So how do you defeat somebody who maybe has advantages over you? How as a man can you overcome somebody who's bigger, stronger, or smarter than you? You got to be crafty, right? You've got to use what you have, right? So he developed a strategy called the Fabian strategy, and still used by militaries today. He is essentially the creator of guerrilla warfare. It was a strategy of attrition, never facing the superior forces head on, always just nitpicking at them. Small encounter here, but never a head-on pitched battle because that he knew he would lose. But he also knew that because Hannibal was across, the Mediterranean, He lost more than half of his troops crossing the Alps. He knew that he couldn't maintain his invasion forever because an army marches on its stomachs, and your supplies are going to run out. So he said, instead of being a hothead and running into battle, let's just grind him down and wear him out through attrition. He's going to get hungry. His troops are going to die. We'll take off a few here. We can't beat him one-on-one, but if we pester him and not fight him, he can't beat us, and he'll have to go home, and we'll save it. Well, everyone called him a coward. They said that he was afraid to fight. There was a lot of criticism of him. They even gave him the nickname in Latin, cunctator, right? Which, means the delayer, right? Basically means, look, he's a chicken. He won't fight them. Mm-hmm. So as soon as his year as consul is up, his dictator is up, they elect 2 new consuls. And these consuls are like, we are not going to be a delayer. We're not going to be a total cunctator like Fabius, right? So they'd get an army of 87,000 men to go and absolutely destroy Hannibal's remaining 35,000 men. And they set up battle, and they're going to go directly at him, what Fabius refused to do in a direct battle at the Battle of Cannae. Rome gets demolished. They get demolished by way less troops, 87,000 to 35 to 40,000. They're outnumbered. They outnumber the Phoenicians 2-1, and they get destroyed. One of the 2 consuls dies in the battle. I mean, consuls, that'd be like, George Washington getting, killed in the Battle of New Jersey. Like, you'd be like, oh man, this is some serious stuff. So they're like, okay, this is a big problem. So they go back. Again, the Senate's freaking out, and they go back and they're like, wait a second, maybe this Fabian strategy was the right thing to do. Maybe, we shouldn't be hotheads. We shouldn't be impetuous. And they go back to Fabius, and they say, hey, maybe you were kind of right here. And he's like, again, being a man of prudence, of calm, of level-headedness, doesn't take it personal, doesn't say, I told you so. He said, I just want to remind you all that I am not the enemy, that Hannibal is the enemy, and I am on your side. And even though I was disgraced and mocked for being a delayer, it's not personal. I'm doing it for the protection of our fellow citizens. And he was renamed dictator and was able to continue the strategy, which ultimately ground down Hannibal and took the greatest threat from the greatest military general in history up until that point and removed it just by being prudent, calm, not being a hothead, not getting caught off in traffic, jumping out of your car and knocking on the guy's window looking for a fist fight, right? But being in control of yourself and understanding what your strengths are and using your strengths to victory instead of being goaded into a non-advantageous scenario. So that's kind of the story of the great delayer Fabius and the founder of guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, no, it's really terrific. And actually, we're just touching on a part of the story because it goes on with
it's a lot more.
2 dictators and exactly. But it is prudence is just that right reason, right, applied to practice. But it's a little bit more than that because it's an intellectual habit that we have to work on as men. We have to be able to see a number of steps ahead. And I think that's really important because very often we need to be, let's just say this, we need to be men of intention, not of reaction. And very often we present ourselves or find ourselves present in a situation where we just react to it. We don't take the time necessary to think through. As fathers and as husbands, we have an obligation to protect our family, not only physically, but also emotionally and spiritually. And so can you see 2 or 3 steps ahead as a man of what your actions will cause? And are your actions going to indeed cause a greater love and a greater harmony and a greater, protection in this analogy here, for your family? And again, we're called to that. And so we have men such as Fabius, who, humorously enough, was proven right, and he was presented with the situation, and he just said, "Let's talk about the elephant in the room here. We're not going to be able to beat those guys," and so really terrific. So I want to move on to the next one, and I am ashamed to say that of all 5 of these men, it was the least that I knew, but it's actually the one that St. Augustine wrote about. So I want to thank Ryan for bringing that to my attention, and we want to talk about honor and Regulus. And so Ryan, if you want to share with us the story of this man.
I got to give a shout out to my son, John. He's 7. And I was preparing my notes for this, and I couldn't remember this figure's name off the top of my head. I'm like, Johnny, what's the dude who went to Phoenicia and got captured and went back? You're talking about Marcus Atilius Regulus. He's like, that's right.
That's awesome. That's so awesome.
So let's shout out Johnny. So Marcus Atilius Regulus, he was actually elected consul right after the term of dictator of Fabius expired. So he was a successor of Fabius. And that strategy had worked, and now the Romans were taking the battle to the Phoenicians. They were no longer fighting the battle primarily in Italy. They were now in North Africa invading because that Fabian strategy had worked so well. And Marcus Atilius Regulus was in command of the troops invading and did pretty well, was doing really well. But one of the weird things about the Roman consul system being that it's 1 year is that you had 1 year to make your bones. You had 1 year to make your legend, gain your honor, get your glory. And it's like, you don't want to be a lame duck. I mean, everyone's a lame duck. You got a year to win the battle. And if you win a battle, if you defeat Carthage, you're going to get the naked statue of you holding a sword in the Roman Forum, and you'll live forever. And if you don't, right, you're just going to be some guy who was just in a list of consuls,
forgotten,
right?
Exactly.
So there's a lot of pressure on these men to accomplish things within their term, which probably led Regulus, we're talking about him on the virtue of honor. It probably led him to be a little bit imprudent and tried to do an invasion when he wasn't quite ready. So this is in 255, and he was trying to basically wrap up the war before his term was up, because then he'd be viewed as the great victor of the Phoenician War, instead of Scipio Africanus, who ultimately was. So he lost the battle in 255 and was captured, okay? Now, he had almost beat them. I mean, the Phoenicians were holding on by a thread, right? And they had barely won this battle. And they capture Regulus, and they say, okay, we will spare your life. But what we want you to do is we want you to go back to the Senate in Rome. We're going to get you a ship. We're going to get you a nice barrel of wine, some food, probably some, cured fish and whatever they eat back then. It's usually olives. And we're going to send you on a boat. You're going to go back to Rome, and you're going to negotiate with the Senate for peace terms, because we're going to spare your life, and you're going to be our advocate, saying the time for the war is over. And they said, now you're going to go. Now, if you are not able to negotiate peace, you are honor bound, and we expect you to make an oath that you will come back here and face a death penalty. And Regulus is like, cool, I'll take that deal. So they get him on a ship. They send him back to Rome. Regulus goes to the Senate. Remember, this is the council, and says, the Phoenicians released me. We lost the battle. They want to negotiate peace terms. And the Senate's like, oh, well, should we? And Regulus is like, abso-freaking-lutely not. They are holding on by a thread. They are one more punch, and they're going to get knocked over. I mean, they're a sheet in the wind right now. Do not negotiate peace. In fact, get another army, go over there, and win the war. They're like, cool. And then Regulus is like, all right, guys, I'm out. I'm going back to Phoenicia. They're like, excuse me, do what now? He's like, I made an oath and a vow that I would go back if I can negotiate peace. Do not negotiate peace. It is not in Rome's interest. But because I made this vow, I'm going back to Carthage. Goes back to Carthage. And everyone's like, wow, that's kind of crazy that you'd keep your oath. They put him in basically an Iron Maiden, which is they put him in a steel box with long nails nailed through the sides so that he could not rest. He had to stand up inside of this box. And if he even tried to lean, he'd be poked by these nails. And he died of starvation, blood loss, and a pretty torturous death in fulfillment of his vow, but on behalf of Rome, that even though his death was going to be painful, it would be beneficial to Rome. even though he could have broken his vow and no one would have expected different, that would have destroyed the Roman trust in the integrity of the office of the consul and of their leadership. You would expect that your leaders were cowards and broke oaths. You didn't break an oath in the ancient world. So this was selfless in that it showed what Roman virtue was, in that it gave the Senate good intelligence, and in that it ultimately, when they would have ended the war maybe prematurely and not won the war, they still went forward. So those are some of the things around this. And a really great retelling of the story is in City of God by St. Augustine. Do you have that part, John?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, absolutely. So it's really fascinating. And the fact that St. Augustine wanted to bring this up is just kind of an example of honor, right? Because what is honor after all? We're bound by justice as men to give honor to whom honor is due. And those include the authority or rulers over us, again, as long as they're not requiring us to sin. Obviously, we know that. But in St. Augustine's City of God, he mentions, and I'll just read the chapter here, or forgive me, I'm not going to read a whole chapter. I'm just reading the paragraph. He says,
I would definitely take a nap on that.
Exactly. He says there's a different elephant in the room from me reading the chapter. So the Senate advised the contrary course, since he did not think it advantageous for the Roman Republic to exchange captives. After giving this advice, he was not forced by his own people to return to the enemy, but because he had taken the oath, he fulfilled it voluntarily. But the Carthaginians put him to death with ingenious and dreadful tortures. They shut him up in a narrow box in which he was forced to stand. It was studded with the sharpest nails on all sides, so that he could not lean on it nowhere without sharp pain. Thus they killed him by keeping him awake. Yeah.
It's great that we're talking about St. Augustine, because he's really the bridge between the Roman classical era and the Christian era.
That's right.
He was raised on, Cicero and Cato and Tertullian and all he was a Roman through and through. And his conversion, to me, marks the end of classical Roman history and the beginning of church history. He is that hinge of history there. But you can see that even in the early church, and I think in the chapter head of this, he says, now look, let's not be confused. Regulus wasn't going to heaven because he didn't have Christian virtue and faith in the triune God. That being said, he still displayed honor and religious honor that, if it had been Christian, would have been worthy of martyrdom, right?
That's right.
But very, very interesting that, again, it's about keeping your vows, meaning what you say, providing an example, even if it's painful. Like, John, how many times with your kids do you provide an example of something that you don't want to do, but you're doing it because you need the kids to see you doing it so that they will be able to make those sacrifices themselves in the future.
Amen. Yeah, absolutely.
That's what he was doing, for the Roman society, and then for his own, virtue and his honor of keeping an oath. Now, I don't know if I would be able to do that. I don't know if I'm that much of an honorable man, but that's why there's not a naked statue of me in the Roman Forum. So,
not yet, anyway.
So, for better or worse, that's the case.
That's right. Awesome. So, our final man, one that you will likely recognize by name more so than anything that we're going to talk about, is Cicero. And I think it's very fascinating to mention Cicero because it's important to note that after the Gutenberg press was created and after the Bible was created, this was one of the next, count on your fingers, one of the next pieces of our work of literature that was printed on it, and it was his philosophical treatise. And so there's a bunch of quotes. Catholic Gentleman's really big on timeless quotes. There's a ton of quotes attributed to Cicero, and one of them every bookworm, every library nerd would have seen is the one that if you have a library and a garden, you have everything you need. And and that comes from Cicero. And so Cicero had a very interesting personality and a very interesting and seated, let's say, a seated historical figure, but one that he pursued wisdom, kind of at all cost. And it's something that is commendable and worth note. Yeah.
So Marcus Tullius Cicero, like you said, I think is one of the great examples of the power of education and the power of being a self-made man. Interesting little note, Cicero is basically the Latin name of chickpea, right?
Chickpea.
So that's like his nickname. His name was Marcus Tullius, the chickpea, right? Probably because he had a little dimple at the end of his nose. Those cognomens those are always interesting to learn about.
Yeah.
So Cicero was... Now, everyone that we've talked to has either been has been either a king or a member of the senatorial class, one of those great families of Rome. Cicero was not one of those members. He was a member of a class called the equestrians. The equestrian class now later in history kind of evolved into the knighthood, right? Equestrian, the horses, basically turned into the knight class, but they were not nobility. They were lesser than nobility. They were the businessmen and the tradesmen and the people who were kind of movers and shakers in society, but didn't have any natural rights as, these patrician families. So he would have been what was called a novus homo, which would have meant a new man, the first person in his family to rise to the rank of a senator. And that was a very, very difficult thing to do in Roman societies, to beat that caste system and go from an equestrian to a senator, right? And climbing up the cursus honorum and making it as a nobody, into the Senate. Barely ever happened. But Cicero did that on the virtue of his education and his powers of oratory. So Cicero, I think you'll see stuff like this with Aquinas later, was a student of Greek philosophy and Greek oratory. So, what made Aquinas stand out from all the other scholastics of the, 12th and 13th century was, his Aristotelian nature, right? And that structured Greek thought. Well, Cicero went down a very similar path, so much that his nickname for a while was, the Greco, right? The Greek, right? And that was kind of the Romans making fun of him, like, you're soft, you're a Greek, right? Yeah. But he studied everything he could. His family was up and coming, equestrian. They weren't lacking means, they were lacking status. Kind of like maybe the Kennedys in the 30s and 40s, like had a lot of money, but no power, kind of an Irish family. You can't really be an Irish family in places of power. But through money and influence, we're able to climb up. I think Cicero is very similar to that. Yeah, so Cicero is kind of like that. He's kind of like those risers in society. And he studied every Greek master, read every tome, studied every rhetorician that he could, and used the power of studiousness, the power of self-mastery to rise in Roman society in a way that was, for the most part, not possible in any other way. Cicero's pretty debated. He had some pretty bad political inclinations. It seems like he always chose the wrong side of a battle or a political concept. He almost always chose the wrong side and ultimately lended himself to his execution. But he believed in Republican values. He was like the last defender of the Republic. So he was alive during the age of first Sulla, who became dictator for life, who conquered Rome in the Roman Civil War, and then during the time of Julius Caesar, right? So Julius Caesar, if you know Roman history, he founded the first triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus. And they were basically saying, look, we're the most powerful men in Rome. What do we need the Senate to tell us what to do? They were creating an oligarchy and usurping the Republican system. That would be like, I don't know, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk saying, look, what do we need the government for? We don't. We got all the money and the power. We're just going to run the stuff, right? And then we'll just pay off the senators to pass the laws we want. We know who the real power is. And that's the danger of the modern world, and that's the danger of the ancient world, right? You had the two greatest generals in Pompey and Julius Caesar. Pompey, the great general of the East, Caesar, the great general of the West, and Crassus, the richest man in the world. They're like, hey, we run the show. And they said, well, let's get some legitimacy and ask this Cicero guy, who's the leading, most respected man in the Senate, because he's the greatest speaker of his age, maybe ever. And Cicero said no. So instead of the triumvirate, it could have been the quadumvirate. I mean, he declined because it was illegal and because he believed in Republican values. That was probably the wrong move to make. I mean, he eschewed certain power. I mean, he would have been way more influential, but instead of a personal thing, he used it as a time to defend the proper systems, the proper rule of law. I think that's a better way of saying it, is that it might not have been even a matter of virtue for him. It would have been about adherence to the rule of law and respecting proper authority and proper channels, respecting proper customs and honors. So eventually, when Brutus and his conspirators assassinated Julius Caesar, they even shouted out, because Crassus was in the Senate, that they said, Cicero. They said, they stabbed Julius Caesar and they said, Cicero, restore the Republic. Like, that's how much they viewed him as a rallying point on the preservation of a republican system instead of an imperial system. Well, now Julius Caesar's dead. Cicero's still in the Republic. Mark Antony is basically Caesar's successor in power, but not in virtue, because you also have Octavian. Well, Cicero is using the powers of his oratory and his tongue. He is eviscerating Mark Antony, saying, look, Antony's doing all kinds of illegal things. He's trying to set himself up as king. Octavian, great kid, love him. Let's give him some honors and make him go away. We don't want another Augustus. We don't need this stuff. Let's go back to the system. Well, basically, it turns out that you have the second triumvirate, which is Octavian, Mark Antony, and I'm just going to lose my Roman card because I can't remember the third. Anyway, the general. And they put Cicero on proscription, which means they wrote a big list of all the people who were enemies, nailed it to the Roman Forum, and anyone could kill them. Yeah. Well, Cicero was in his little cart or whatever. They found him. Cicero didn't refuse. He stuck out his head and said, look, what you're doing is illegal and the wrong thing, but at least make my execution the right way, right? Don't make it sloppy. Cut my head off neat. They cut off his head and his hands. They nailed his hands to the rostra, where he used to put his hands on when he was speaking. They nailed his hands there, put his head right on the rostra. And it's even said that Antony's wife pulled out his tongue and was sitting there poking it with a needle because his tongue was that dangerous that people had to use swords against it. But Cicero, again, is an example of a self-made man who used his education to rise to levels of power to where he was able to at least stand up against the most powerful men in the world who had wealth, military, and violence. He was able to counter them with intellect, discourse, dialogue, and cunning.
Yeah, no, I think you're it's so fascinating, right? Because he actually admired virtue, right? He, like you said, it was a part of him, and he really held it to the highest standard, even to the point of maybe lacking a certain degree of social awareness, right? There's stories of him going around and pointing at every single member in the Senate and calling them out for their lack of virtue and their vices that they display. And so being able to, and even a step further, he actually championed chastity. He actually championed purity in a time of licentiousness and wickedness, all over the place, which is so fascinating for a man to hold those ideals so strong, those truths so strong that he's willing to do everything. And like you said, he had a bit of a sense of humor, right? There's nothing proper about what you men are doing, but, properly kill me. And,
exactly.
and so I think that's so fascinating. There's a couple of things though, like one of the quotes that we have coming down from him is, where there is life, there is hope. And it's little statements like this that actually the Catholic Church, and I think it was, the Catholic Church is the reason why we have all the writings of Cicero, right? They protected the writings of Cicero. They called him a noble pagan, which basically just meant he displayed, kind of intrinsically or naturally, the virtues which we now know by the grace of God and by the power of our baptism and the history of the Judeo-Christian religion, that this is the truth. This is the way. And he upheld those kind of intrinsically in a way that he deserved to maintain a status within the history of men, and not just removed into oblivion or lost to the times. And so
I think it speaks to him being able to find and pursue natural law. Right? Natural law is the law written on all humanity and all creation by God, even if it's not revealed to us by revelation or in the person of Jesus Christ. natural law exists for all men and all things, even if you're a caveman or if you're going to be someone 3,000 years from now on a distant planet. Natural law will still exist in the hearts and in the very structure of creation. And when you say noble pagan, you'll have noble pagans like Cicero, like Aristotle, right? Or the a lot of ancients. And it's that they were able to discern and see the virtues through the natural law God imprinted on creation. That's a really important thing that, again, looking at these virtues is that they're able to spot, even in a pre-incarnational world. And we did, again, not only because it's the Republican era and they better displayed virtue, but because these people are all before Christ. Yeah. So after Christ, if they were still Romans and not Christians, well, then that's maybe a bit of a strike against them for a show called The Catholic Gentleman. But these men all found those virtues in a world before Christ's incarnation. That's why they're listed as virtuous pagans or displayed those characteristics of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been such an incredible conversation. I'm so grateful to finally have you on, Ryan, and one of hopefully the first of many. John. Yeah, I know. I'm really blessed, and so yeah, it's incredible. Any thoughts you want to leave men as they finish this episode and they're like, where can I learn more, or what can I do? Also, where can they follow you, Ryan? Where can they learn more information about all the great work you're doing?
Sure. So the podcast I have is with my two buddies, Ryan De La Crosse and Father Richard Pagano. It's the Catholic Talk Show. You can find us on all the platforms, YouTube and all the podcast platforms, or go to CatholicTalkShow.com and learn more there. And we cover a lot of things like this, history and theology, but we have a little bit of fun with it. So I think we are the less refined, unvirtuous version of the Catholic Gentleman. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of like you guys are the more refined version of us. And I regret that Sam couldn't join us for the one. I love Sam too, but John is one of my best friends in the entire world. But if you're looking to learn more about the history of Rome, and I think by the virtue of you listening here on a podcast or on YouTube, make sure to click the like and subscribe button right now, especially on this episode. That way John has me back, right? Because That's right. If this episode doesn't do well, I'm not going to be invited back, and I'd really like to be. But there's a couple great podcasts. I think you look at Mike Duncan's History of Rome. This was done about 10 years ago. He does the entire history of Rome. Amazing, comprehensive job. It's free, so worth it. I think you can look at if you're looking for the kind of the Republican era, I think you can look at a podcast. It's, I think, 4-part podcast by Hardcore History called The Death Throes of the Republic. Great one. Dan Carlin. And then the classical Dan Carlin, yeah. And then the all-time classic work on the matter. If you're looking for more history of Rome, there's, Mary Beard is a great one. But then there's Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. But learn about history, learn about Rome, learn about the things that are interesting, because really it shows you the best examples of virtue and vice throughout history. It shows you what to do and what not to do. It gives you all those lessons that you might have to learn otherwise a hard way. Yeah. So as a society, we can see things that cause the downfalls of society and cause the ascent of other societies. As a man, we can see the things that created great men and destroyed other men. We can see the things that created lasting effect, and we can see the things that destroyed legacies. We can see the things that made a man's name live on through history and things that made a man's name be cursed and blotted out from memory. Yeah. And you'll always see that it's these virtues, and virtues don't change. Virtues are not something that are malleable with time. A virtuous man would be virtuous in the 3rd century BC and in today's world. What's right is right and what's wrong is wrong, and it doesn't matter on popular opinion. And you can see that throughout the course of history. So by studying history, there's so much benefit to it. And read it with your kids too, man. Kids love history, boys and girls. Yeah. They love knowing that stuff. It's one of the most fascinating things. And I think even if you look at like young people's attraction to more traditional forms of the Mass, whether it's the Tridentine Mass or John, the Ordinariate, they want those things that the world cannot provide. And those things are traditions, because those are the things that our ancestors have left to us, right? Those are the things that are the flames of our ancestors still burning, not the smoke of the dying embers. And young people are attracted to that because it's something counter to the world. It's something true, authentic, and tested by time. So for the same reason young people like traditional Catholic devotions, this is the same reason that they're going to like history, and I think that they play well together in the education of the young, and also in the establishment of virtue in yourself and in the society and the way you handle yourself. So I can't recommend it enough. And John, it's, great pleasure to have been on the Catholic Gentleman, and I just want to vouch that I am a member of the Catholic Gentleman Plus. I saw that, and I joined, so I'd recommend everyone do the same thing as well.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate it. It has been an honor having you on, and I am grateful. And I want to end with a quote here from Cicero. I started with a quote, and I want to end with a quote. The earlier quote was Cicero encouraging men and extolling men to practice, or extolling men who practice virtue and encouraging you to do so. And I want to finish here with a quote from Cicero, is that the life of the dead is placed in the memory of the living. And that's us, men. And so we need to better understand those things so that we can better understand virtue. We can better understand when it presents itself in our lives so that we can live it truthfully and we can live it for Christ and for others. And so again, thank you so much, Ryan, for joining me today. And as we end each of our episodes, be a man, be a saint.